Hello and welcome. I'm glad you've chosen to drift back with me tonight. Let's slip quietly into the folds of history, where forgotten voices and shadowed corners of the past wait to be gently illuminated. Maybe you're listening from a dimly lit room, letting sleep slowly steal over you. Or perhaps you're simply taking a moment to rest your busy thoughts. Either way, I'm honored to share this space with you. Tell me in the comments where in the world you're joining from. Are we oceans apart or only separated by the soft passage of nightfall? If you find calm in hushed journeys through time and tender explorations of how people once lived, thought, and dreamed, consider subscribing. We have countless hidden stories yet to uncover. Tonight, we'll peer into a world where the concept of law was a tapestry woven not only from reason and fairness, but from deep superstition, rigid faith, and solutions so peculiar they seem almost like folklore. The medieval mind saw justice through a lens very different from ours, where precedent and logic often bowed to ritual, fear, and the invisible hand of divine will. Let's open that door together and see what waited on the other side. As the last light of day retreats beyond the horizon, it leaves behind a sky awash with the fading hues of amber and rose, slowly surrendering to the deep, tranquil blue of approaching night. Tiny pinpricks of brilliance begin to emerge, scattered across the heavens like a promise of countless stories waiting to be told. Somewhere in this gentle twilight, where the world seems to pause between the sun's parting glow and the moon's cautious rise, we find ourselves on the threshold of another time. A time whose shadows still stretch long into our present, whispering to us across the gulf of centuries. Imagine you are standing at the edge of a narrow, winding road that cuts through a countryside both familiar and foreign. The trees are ancient sentinels, their gnarled branches creaking with secrets that predate your every known history. A cool breeze drifts by, carrying with it the earthy scent of damp soil and wood smoke. Maybe it also brings with it faint echoes, voices too soft to make out, laughter laced with a strain of fear, the rustle of hurried footsteps retreating into the safety of darkened cottages. It is here, beneath these gathering stars, that we prepare to journey back, past the reach of modern memory, into a world that was at once breathtakingly beautiful and quietly terrifying. Why should we care about laws written long ago in brittle ink on parchment now crumbling to dust? Why concern ourselves with decrees carved into weathered stones that have long since lost their edges to rain and wind? The answer lies not simply in curiosity, but in understanding ourselves. Those laws, strange and at times absurd as they may appear, were born of a human need to impose order upon chaos, to find meaning amid uncertainty. And more importantly, they were born out of fear of the unknown, fear of one's neighbors, fear of divine displeasure. In this fear, these people created rules that governed every breath and movement, often with consequences that seem almost surreal to us now. As night deepens and the chorus of nocturnal insects swells, let us draw closer to the small, flickering lanterns dotting a medieval village. Through narrow lanes, we glimpse humble cottages with walls of wattle and daub, thatched roofs that whisper with the touch of each passing breeze. Within these homes, families huddle close, seeking warmth not only from the modest hearth, but from each other. Outside, the world holds dangers that few wish to tempt after dark. Wolves roam forests not far beyond the fields, and still more sinister threats might be imagined lurking in the gloom. Spirits unsettled by improper burials, or wandering souls burdened by unresolved grievances. Yet the greatest threats of all do not always come padded on four silent paws or borne upon ghostly winds. They often walk upright, draped in authority, carrying torches that promise both light and judgment. The very laws that promise protection can transform in an instant into instruments of cruelty. In this fragile world, where a failed harvest could unravel a village and a simple rumor could doom a household, the power of these laws was immense. To understand them is to understand the delicate balance upon which medieval life was suspended. Perhaps this is why there is a peculiar allure in exploring these ancient codes and customs. At first glance, many seem laughably out of step with reason. A pig tried for harming a child, an iron forced into the hands of the accused to prove innocence, a field of grain cursed by clergy for harboring pests. Such spectacles border on the fantastical, but under the faint amusement lies something darker. These were not fables or exaggerated legends. They were real mechanisms of control, born from genuine beliefs and enforced by communities that saw them as vital to survival. In them, we glimpse a reflection of our own timeless anxieties, our need for justice, our dread of chaos, and our desperate hope that someone somewhere is watching and will set the scales right.
So, let us step quietly into their world. Let us breathe the heavy scent of livestock mingled with damp straw. Feel the uneven cobblestones underfoot. Hear the clamor of a marketplace closing for the night. Let us listen closely to the stories these places have long waited to tell. For beyond the quaint images painted by illuminated manuscripts, beyond the idyllic illusions of courtly songs, there lies a harsher truth, a truth that will guide us through torchlit courtrooms and overgrown fields of unmarked graves, through feasting halls thick with laughter that masks suspicion, and down winding roads where law and superstition intertwine. It is here, beneath the velvet sky dotted with ancient stars, that our journey begins. And as we trace the lines of old laws etched deep into the marrow of medieval life, we may find they are not so distant from us after all. For even now, long after these decrees have faded into the obscurity of historical footnotes, the fears that gave birth to them still echo in our hearts. They caution us, warn us, and perhaps in their own way, protect us. So, take a steady breath. Steady your thoughts against the cool embrace of the past, and prepare to follow where these shadowed paths will lead. Because behind every peculiar statute and every grim ritual stands a very human story, one that is not only worth telling, but necessary to remember. The deeper we slip into the hush of medieval night, the more clearly we begin to perceive the contours of a world governed by ideas, both alien and hauntingly familiar. In this dim-lit tapestry of village streets, castle courtyards, and cloistered gardens, law was not merely a system of regulation. It was a living, breathing testament to how people understood the universe and their precarious place within it. For the medieval mind, law did not arise simply from the collective will of the people or the authority of a monarch. It was woven from the very fabric of divine order. Imagine for a moment standing in a small timber-framed hall, its beams heavy with the scent of old smoke and sweat, where villagers have gathered to witness a judgment. A local lord sits at the far end, his seat slightly elevated, a carved symbol of his God-given right to rule above them. At his side stands a priest, fingers lightly touching a worn book of scripture, as if ready to remind all present that these proceedings are not only sanctioned by earthly powers, but by heaven itself. Here, there is no sharp division between what we would call law and religion. To violate the law is to disturb the delicate order God has set upon the world, an act that risks far more than temporal penalty. It threatens one's very soul.
And so it was that the codes and customs of medieval Europe reached far beyond mere social convenience. They represented a profound moral architecture, believed essential to uphold cosmic balance. To live rightly under the law was not just a matter of civic duty, it was a sacred obligation, a way of aligning oneself with divine will. This explains why the punishments we find so disproportionate, mutilations for theft, public penances for gossip, death for offenses that might earn a fine today, seemed to medieval people not cruel but necessary. In their eyes, justice was not an abstract scale that might tip toward mercy or severity based on circumstance. It was a sacred mirror reflecting heaven's own unyielding expectations. Consider how this understanding colored even the simplest quarrels. If two peasants clashed over a boundary stone displaced by a swollen stream, it was not only a matter of property. The land itself was thought to lie within a divine order, each field granted by providence. To misplace a border was to infringe upon a harmony believed established by God's unseen hand. Thus, the local court would convene, the village would gather, oaths would be sworn on relics, and the matter settled in ritual that resonated far beyond mere earthly concern. This profound intertwining of law with sacred conviction meant that medieval people often accepted judgments and penalties we might find grotesque with a sense of resigned piety. A merchant caught cheating his scales might be paraded through the streets with weights hung painfully from his neck, not only to shame him before neighbors, but to cleanse the community of a spiritual stain. It was believed that sin, if left unchecked, could draw divine displeasure down upon an entire village. Rain might fail, plague might come, war might darken the horizon. By punishing wrongdoers visibly and harshly, communities sought to avert calamity, to prove to the watching heavens their continued worthiness. Even the language used in medieval courts revealed this mindset. Judgments were rendered in formulas that invoked God and saints, not only kings or barons. Witnesses were required to swear on holy relics, so that perjury became not just a lie, but an offense that might provoke eternal consequences. In disputes over contracts, marriages, or inheritances, clerics were often brought in to ensure that the decisions made aligned with moral law as much as with local custom. For most people, there was little sense of a difference. Legal breaches were moral breaches, punishable not only by man, but by powers vastly beyond human reach.
This belief system also explains why communities sometimes seem to seek out supernatural involvement in their justice. Trial by ordeal, which might today look like an act of sheer barbarism, was regarded then as a direct appeal to divine judgment. If God governed all things, surely he would reveal guilt or innocence by guiding the outcome of the ordeal. Whether it was carrying a glowing piece of iron or plunging a hand into scalding water, these acts were meant to pull aside the veil between the earthly and the divine, forcing heaven itself to render a verdict that human eyes could see. Thus, the law served not just to order society, but to anchor it to a cosmic framework that medieval people believed was perpetually threatened by human weakness and sin. Crime was more than a violation of trust between neighbors. It was a crack in the wall that held back chaos, a fissure through which disorder might spill into the ordered world. And so the community gathered not only to see justice done, but to participate in a reaffirmation of the fragile balance that kept them safe. For the villagers who returned home after such public judgments, hearts still pounding from the gravity of the proceedings, there was comfort in knowing the universe had been righted once again, if only for a time. Each harsh penalty was a stone placed back into the bulwark that shielded them from forces too vast and terrible to fully comprehend. By accepting the law, by participating in its rituals and acknowledging its judgments, they joined themselves once more to a divine order that promised, if not earthly fairness, then at least a hope of spiritual security. This is why, when we read of medieval people flocking to witness trials and executions with what seems like ghoulish fascination, we miss a crucial layer. They were not simply seeking spectacle, they were watching a sacred drama unfold. It was a communal act of reaffirming the rules by which the cosmos operated. To see justice done was to feel assured that God still watched, still cared, still kept the intricate wheels of the universe turning despite human failings. So when we peer into their ancient laws that judged animals, punished objects, and demanded blood for wrongdoing, we are not merely peering into strange old codes of a backward era. We are looking into a mirror that reflected back to medieval people the vast, mysterious order they believed underlay every blade of grass and every star in the sky. The law, in their world, was not merely written in ink or proclaimed from pulpits. It was etched into the very bones of existence, and through it, they hoped to keep at bay the shadows that ever threatened to spill across their fragile circles of firelight, reminding them that to falter was to invite both earthly ruin and something far more eternal.
It is difficult for us now, resting in a world ruled by microscopes and genetic charts, to truly grasp the mindset that could lead an entire community to gather solemnly in a dusty square and watch as a pig stood trial for taking a human life. Yet this was not some isolated peculiarity of a confused village lost to superstition. It was part of a widespread legal tapestry that stretched across medieval Europe for hundreds of years. In these centuries, it was not only men and women who bore the heavy weight of the law's scrutiny. Beasts, too, pigs, bulls, goats, and even tiny pests, could be summoned before magistrates, judged and sentenced with all the somber ritual that human defendants faced. Picture a small town on the edge of France, perhaps in the waning days of the 14th century. The villagers gather near a wooden platform set up in front of the church. The priest stands nearby, robes catching the breeze, ready to intone prayers that would lend divine gravity to the proceedings. A scribe sharpens his quill, preparing to record every utterance for the official record. The local magistrate clears his throat. Before him stands not a shivering peasant, but a stout sow, her bristles caked with mud, a rope looped awkwardly around her middle. A bailiff holds the end firmly, as though she might somehow bolt in panic from the weight of human accusation. Not long before, the villagers' calm routines had been shattered. A child had wandered too close to the pigsty. What followed was gruesome, an event that left the community stricken, grappling for a way to respond. Yet for them, the response did not lie only in grief or new safety measures. It lay in exacting justice, not just from negligent owners, but from the creature itself. In their eyes, the pig had committed a moral offense. It had crossed an invisible, divinely sanctioned line by shedding human blood, and that demanded more than slaughter in a back corner of a farm. It required public reckoning. So the pig was tried formally. Witnesses were called.
The mother of the child testified through tears. Neighbors recounted what they had seen, how the animal lunged, how it did not release. The defense was minimal but not absent. Medieval records are rich with evidence that animals often had lawyers appointed to represent them. These advocates argued, sometimes earnestly, that their clients had been provoked, mistreated, or simply incapable of understanding the nature of their acts. There is a recorded case where villagers swore under oath to a donkey's gentle nature, insisting she should be spared the fate of her accused human companion. In that rare instance, the donkey was acquitted, saved by testimonials of her good character, while the man involved met a harsher end.
But such mercy was uncommon. The pig, in our imagined village, was found guilty. She would be dressed in a crude tunic, an eerie echo of human criminal garb, and led to the place of execution, where onlookers gathered to witness a justice they believed necessary to restore the broken moral order. The act itself was brutal, yet it served a purpose beyond punishment. It was a ritual purification of sorts, intended to cleanse the stain that might otherwise invite divine displeasure upon them all. Even more startling to modern ears is how thoroughly these ideas extended to creatures far smaller and more numerous than livestock. Insects, too, in all their creeping multitudes, could face the full theater of the law. When swarms of locusts devastated fields or tiny weevils hollowed out precious stores of grain, medieval villagers did not see this purely as a quirk of natural cycles. They understood such infestations as direct disturbances of the moral balance that governed creation. And so the law was invoked. Bishops and priests would be petitioned to bring charges against these pests. Formal documents were drafted, elegantly penned writs calling beetles or caterpillars to appear in court. Of course, no tiny creature would ever march into a hall to answer such summons, but this did not stop the proceedings. Trials went forward with full solemnity. In one remarkable case from 16th century France, the local ecclesiastical court ordered a swarm of locusts to vacate the fields under threat of excommunication. When they failed to comply, a sentence was pronounced that effectively expelled them from the lands, forbidding them under divine penalty to remain.
It is easy now to laugh at such rituals, to dismiss them as quaint or pitiably ignorant, yet these practices rested on the same belief system that shaped medieval law in every other respect, the conviction that all of creation was bound by a divine structure, a vast moral architecture where every creature had a place and a purpose. When an animal harmed a human, or when insects devoured the fruits of honest toil, they were not simply behaving according to instinct or hunger. They were breaking a contract, a sacred expectation that each part of God's creation would uphold its appointed role. By prosecuting these offenders, communities did more than seek vengeance. They sought to reaffirm their alignment with divine will. The trials served as collective declarations that human society remained vigilant, unwilling to tolerate disorder in any form. They were, in a sense, appeals to heaven, signaling that if calamity struck, it was not for lack of effort on their part to maintain the moral equilibrium. It was also a powerful reassurance to frightened people. To see that even the lowliest creatures could be summoned to court meant there was a measure of control, however illusory, over the unpredictable forces that threatened their fragile existence. Perhaps most profoundly, these trials reveal how differently medieval people saw themselves in relation to the world around them. For us, animals exist largely apart from moral responsibility. We cage them, domesticate them, study them, but we do not judge them in our courts for their crimes. Medieval villagers, by contrast, lived cheek by jowl with beasts whose lives and deaths were tightly interwoven with their own. They depended on animals for labor, food, and warmth, yet these same creatures could turn on them, could bite, trample, gore. In making them subject to human laws, people of that era drew a protective circle around their communities, one enforced not just by pitchforks and fences, but by solemn oaths and the full pageantry of legal ritual. In these dimly lit courtrooms and open village squares, with pigs clad in rough cloth and tiny parchment scrolls condemning insects by the thousands, we glimpse a worldview profoundly committed to moral order, one where the boundaries between humanity, beast, and divine law blurred in ways we can scarcely comprehend today. And so the trials continued, year after year, a strange, steadfast affirmation that in a universe teetering always on the brink of chaos, every creature could be called to account, every sin could be answered for, and through this relentless pursuit of justice, the community might yet stave off the darker fates that forever lurked at the edge of the candle's glow.
Stranger still than the solemn trials of pigs and grasshoppers were the occasions when medieval courts turned their stern gaze upon the silent objects that populated daily life. In these moments, the very boundary between the animate and the inanimate dissolved, swept away by a worldview that saw all creation, stone, wood, iron, flesh, woven into the same vast moral tapestry. If a pig could be held accountable for the spilling of human blood, why not the cold steel of a sword, or the patient trunk of a tree whose fall claimed an innocent life? And so it happened, with surprising frequency and complete seriousness, that objects themselves were summoned before judges, condemned, and banished or destroyed, all in the name of restoring the delicate balance of a universe believed to be perpetually under threat. Picture, if you will, the grim hush that might settle over a village after a particularly brutal accident. A traveling merchant, passing beneath the ancient limbs of an oak at the village's edge, crushed without warning by a branch that chose that moment to split and plummet. The villagers gather in horror, crossing themselves, whispering fearful prayers. For them, this was not merely an unfortunate twist of nature or an example of simple misfortune. It was a disruption of the moral order, a trespass against the sacred harmony believed to govern every living and unloving thing. Soon after, the local lord or a church official would arrive, robes billowing, accompanied by scribes and bailiffs. The tree was identified, its rough bark touched almost tenderly, as though it might offer an explanation. And then, as incredible as it sounds, a formal indictment might be read aloud, charging the oak with causing wrongful harm. Witnesses testified. Some might recall how the tree's limbs had grown heavy and threatening for years, how its shadow seemed colder than any others. When the proceedings concluded, a verdict would be pronounced. If found guilty, the tree was sentenced to be felled, its wood often burned or carted off far from the place where the tragedy struck, ensuring that the taint of its crime did not linger to poison the land or people who remained. Nor was this peculiar justice reserved only for trees. Swords, too, found themselves brought under the heavy scrutiny of the law. If a blade slipped from its owner's grasp and ended a life, or if it was wielded in a murder most foul, courts sometimes turned their retribution not only on the hand that guided the steel, but on the weapon itself. A sword might be tried, declared guilty, and then subjected to an eerie ritual of exile. Officials might carry it beyond the borders of the town or even the realm itself, casting it into a river or burying it deep where no future hand might chance upon it and resurrect the evil that clung to its edge. This was no idle symbolism. It was believed that the object, having once served wrongdoing, might harbor a sort of dark memory, a lingering moral corruption that could inspire or enable fresh misdeeds. Equally telling were the cases involving bells, those grand resonant instruments that hung in church towers and summoned the faithful with voices that rolled over fields and rooftops alike. Bells were deeply embedded in the spiritual and social life of medieval communities. They marked the hours, warned of approaching armies, celebrated marriages, tolled for funerals. But they could also, in the medieval mind, stir darker forces. There are recorded incidents where bells were charged with having rung during violent storms,
as though their brazen peals had awakened the wrath of heavens or drawn the very tempest upon the village. In such cases, the bells were formally condemned and might be removed from their towers, exiled to distant parishes, or recast entirely so that the guilt within their metal was melted away. What might seem to us the height of absurdity was underpinned by the same profound logic that governed trials of people and animals. To medieval folk, every part of creation was bound in a vast web of responsibility. They believed the divine order set forth by the Creator imbued all things, from the noblest cathedral arch to the simplest plowshare, with a place and a duty. When that duty was betrayed, when a tree took a life it should have sheltered, when a blade spilled innocent blood, when a bell called down the storm instead of safeguarding the harvest, the community had not only the right but the solemn obligation to correct the transgression. In doing so, they restored balance, soothed divine anger, and protected themselves from the spectral fears that crept ever closer when such cosmic debts went unpaid. There is also something strangely comforting in these rituals, seen through medieval eyes. By holding even the lifeless accountable, they maintained a universe where every wrong could be righted, every sorrow given its answer. It offered an explanation when accident struck, a clear moral cause behind cruel randomness, and, most importantly, a means of action. To cut down the guilty tree, to banish the murderous sword, to silence the bell that called the storm, was to push back against the gnawing chaos that forever lurked beyond the fragile walls of human settlement. And so these trials of mute defendants continued, often with the same painstaking attention given to any human case. Records were kept, formal pronouncements written and archived, as though future generations might need to understand why a venerable oak vanished from the village's edge, why a once proud bell no longer graced the church steeple. In these careful documents, we glimpse the seriousness with which people of that era approached their world, refusing to dismiss any event, however bewildering, as mere chance. Instead, they wove each incident into their intricate moral tapestry, ensuring that even silent things stood subject to judgment under the ever-watchful eyes of heaven and their community.
Thus the stones of medieval courtyards, the timbers of village halls, and the iron of old swords carried more than just weight or utility. They bore a subtle, living significance, forever at risk of crossing from harmless object to culpable entity. In this way, the medieval world was alive in ways we can scarcely imagine today. Alive not just with bustling markets and crowded feasts, but with an intense sacred vigilance that bound everything, breathing or still, into the same vast drama of sin, punishment, and hoped-for redemption. Among the countless shadows that haunted the medieval imagination, few loomed larger than the fear of hidden guilt. It was one thing to watch a neighbor confess beneath the stern glare of a local magistrate, or to see a thief cornered by angry townsfolk caught with stolen bread still warm in his hands. But far more troubling were the accusations that settled like a miasma over communities. Charges of blasphemy whispered behind closed doors, rumors of treachery that stalked narrow lanes at night, or the creeping suspicion that someone harbored a sin so grave it invited not just human outrage, but divine wrath. In such a world, where oaths were as binding as chains, and a man's honor wove tightly into the fragile fabric that held villages together, how could one ever be sure who was innocent and who masked their corruption behind trembling prayers? Enter the grim theater of trial by ordeal, perhaps the most chilling testament to how thoroughly medieval justice was entwined with the conviction that God would not suffer an innocent soul to be condemned. To modern eyes, these ordeals appear as little more than barbaric torture cloaked in pious ritual. But to the people of that era, they were powerful instruments of truth, tests by which heaven itself was compelled to reveal secrets too dark for mortal judgment alone. Picture a small crowd gathered outside a timbered church. The morning sun slices through rising mist, illuminating anxious faces.
At the center stands the accused, hands bound, head lowered in exhausted prayer. Nearby, priests chant solemn invocations, calling upon the Almighty to watch what is about to unfold. The air smells of incense, sweat, and something sharper, iron heated until it glows a fierce, unforgiving red. This is the ordeal of hot iron, one of the most feared judgments a soul might face. Under careful supervision, the glowing bar is pressed into the suspect's hands, or they are commanded to carry it several paces before it drops from blistering palms. The wound is then bound, swathed in linens blessed with holy oil. For 3 days, the village waits. When at last the bandages are unwrapped, trembling hands reveal their secrets. If the flesh heals clean, smooth, and pink, it is a sign of innocence, a miracle wrought by divine intervention. If it festers or blackens, the infection is read as proof of guilt.
Equally harrowing was the ordeal by boiling water. A great iron cauldron stands at the edge of the square, bubbles bursting on its turbulent surface. The crowd recoils slightly at the sharp hiss of rising steam. Into this churning vat, a stone or small ring is dropped, sinking into depths that promise agony. The accused steps forward, often after days of fasting and prayer meant to purify the spirit and coax God's favor. At a signal from the priest, they plunge their hand deep into the cauldron, groping blindly through searing heat until fingers close on the submerged token. Like the ordeal of hot iron, the wound is then bound, the bandages entrusted with both the body's and the soul's fate. Days later, the healing, or the lack of it, speaks the verdict no earthly judge could rightly declare on his own. But perhaps the most sinister of these divine interrogations was trial by cold water, whose cruel paradox left many with little real chance of surviving unscathed. Bound tightly with ropes, the accused is led to a pond or river consecrated by a priest's blessings. Here the belief reversed. Water, considered a pure and sacred element, would accept the innocent, allowing them to sink into its embrace, while the guilty would be rejected, forced to bob and flounder on the surface. The logic carried a dreadful twist. Those who sank were quickly hauled back by waiting ropes, if the rescuers acted swiftly enough, then declared pure of the charges. Those who floated, eyes wide with terror, limbs thrashing in desperation, found no such relief. Their buoyancy was seen not as the frantic struggle of a body fighting death, but as undeniable testimony that corruption lived within them. For them, earthly punishment awaited on the shore, grim and immediate. In all these ordeals, the chilling common thread was a profound trust in divine oversight. If the accused suffered unduly, it was assumed God permitted it because guilt stained their heart. This conviction brought comfort to communities terrified of hidden threats. After all, in an age plagued by famine, pestilence, and sudden violence, people needed assurance that some moral compass existed beyond flawed human judgment. They clung to the belief that heaven's eye was vigilant, willing to intercede dramatically to maintain order among its mortal children. Yet the dark logic of these practices also revealed the terrible weight of living in such a universe. For the accused, there was little solace in knowing the ordeal might clear their name. The body does not easily triumph over glowing iron or roiling water, no matter the purity of one's conscience. Many who faced such tests were doomed not by hidden sin, but by the simple, inescapable frailty of flesh. Infection followed even minor burns. A hand plunged into boiling water could hardly emerge unscarred. And floating on water, especially when bound in restrictive knots, was often less about divine judgment than cruel trickery of physics. Still, entire communities stood by these grim ceremonies. They gathered in hushed crowds, watched with wide, anxious eyes, and held their breath as bindings were unwound, as hands emerged from their holy dressings. Gasps of relief or sighs of sorrow rippled through onlookers depending on what was revealed. For them,
These moments confirmed that their world, with all its unpredictable darkness, remained under the watchful gaze of a higher power that would not allow wickedness to hide behind tears or trembling confessions. Thus, the ordeal by fire and water endured, passed down across generations, and woven into the very heartbeat of medieval justice. They were more than punishments or tests. They were sacred dramas, binding the community together in shared awe and fear. Through them, villagers believed they glimpsed the hand of heaven moving upon earth, an affirmation that the struggle for truth and order was not waged alone. It was waged with divine company, however severe its methods might appear to those whose eyes have grown used to gentler forms of justice. And so, time and again, these rituals played out beneath sun and rain, beneath the soaring hymns of cathedrals or the quiet prayers of humble parish churches, each a grim testament to how fiercely humanity has always sought certainty in a world forever balanced between light and shadow. Of all the eerie customs that wrapped medieval justice in its dense, choking cloak of ritual and dread, few were as gripping, as raw, or as steeped in spectacle as the trial by combat. Here, under the open sky or within crude wooden arenas hastily erected in meadows, disputes were settled not by the measured weighing of evidence, nor by the calm reasoning of learned judges, but by the brute force of muscle and steel. In these contests, the sword or mace was not merely a weapon. It was believed to be an instrument through which the divine hand might move, guiding the blows of the righteous and steering the coward's arm astray. To fight was to call upon God himself to declare a verdict, to let victory stand as the ultimate, unchallengeable proof of innocence. Picture the tense moments before such a contest. Crowds gather along the edge of a sun-baked field, shifting from foot to foot, breath caught between fascination and fear. Vendors hawk cups of sour ale, children press forward for a better view, and old women mutter protective prayers beneath their breath. At the center stand the two combatants, glaring at each other with a hostility sharpened not merely by personal hatred, but by the knowledge that only one of them will walk away with freedom and honor intact. The other may fall to the ground, body broken, or rise again only to be seized and dragged off to face punishment decreed by his own defeat. The disputes that brought people to this terrifying pass varied wildly. Neighbors might accuse each other of theft or treachery. Merchants might squabble over contracts. But what strikes deepest are the tales of accusations that touched the most intimate bonds. Challenges over fidelity, property rights tied to widows and orphans, claims of betrayal that carried with them the heavy weight of social ruin. In these cases, a frail woman or an elderly man might stand beside a hired champion, a towering figure clad in padded leather or chainmail, who would raise his visor only long enough to nod curtly to the crowd before settling into his deadly work. For indeed, not all who demanded a trial by combat were physically capable of taking up arms themselves. The medieval system allowed, even expected, that someone too old, too weak, or simply not trained in the arts of war could appoint another to stand in their stead. These champions were often professional fighters, seasoned men who drifted from village to village, living on coin and the edge of blades, their reputations as powerful as their broad shoulders. A wealthy merchant or a baroness accused of violating a feudal contract might secure the services of a champion renowned across counties, someone who bore scars like trophies and who had already survived countless such trials. The poor, by contrast, had few options. They might beg favors from local knights or appeal to distant relatives with military training. But more often they scraped together coins to hire whatever rough soul would accept their meager purse. In some tragic instances, they were forced to enter the ring themselves, clutching borrowed swords with trembling hands, staring across the field at adversaries whose very posture exuded easy, practiced menace. It is not difficult to imagine how these encounters ended. Against skill honed by years of brutal living, desperation rarely stood a chance. And so the contest commenced. Trumpets might blare or drums pound a slow, foreboding rhythm as the fighters circled each other, shields raised, blades flashing in sudden arcs. Onlookers gasped and clutched at each other with every strike, every grunt of pain. Blood soaking into trampled grass was not just evidence of violence, it was taken as testimony rendered by the heavens. Should the accuser's champion prevail, the accused would be pronounced guilty, seized, and led away for punishment that might range from heavy fines to bodily harm or long imprisonment. If the accused or his champion triumphed, it was taken as undeniable proof that the charges had been false, and the accuser would sometimes face penalties for daring to bring forward an unjust claim. Among the most unsettling facets of this practice was the unquestioning faith that the outcome was divinely ordained. No matter how lopsided the match, how obviously ill-prepared one combatant might be, the crowd would still watch with bated breath, convinced that the Almighty would guide the true hand. The idea that a stronger arm or cleverer tactic might simply overpower a truthful cause seemed to stir little concern. If the weaker party lost, well, perhaps that was itself a sign of hidden guilt, a flaw of spirit that God chose to punish through the obvious medium of shattered bone. Women, too, were drawn into this harsh theater in ways both direct and deeply symbolic. A widow defending her late husband's estate might have no choice but to see her champion take the field against a cousin or rival claimant. Even more disturbingly, in rare but recorded instances, a woman might be forced to defend herself. Some regions devised grim modifications to preserve the illusion of fairness. The man would stand in a waist-deep pit, armed with a cudgel, while the woman was granted more freedom to move outside its rim, wielding a weighted cloth. The grotesque mismatch of such encounters speaks volumes of a society determined to cling to ritual even when it bordered on the grotesque. To witness one of these combats was to be drawn into a ritual as old as the notion of trial itself. A ritual that fused fear, spectacle, and spiritual reckoning into a single brutal event. Spectators were not merely indulging morbid curiosity. They were there to see justice manifest before their eyes, to watch as God's favor descended like a silent hand upon the worthy. For a society that understood law as an echo of divine harmony, trial by combat was the ultimate, unassailable proof that the moral architecture of the cosmos still held firm.
Yet beneath this solemn trust lay quieter truths that went unspoken. The strong nearly always won. Wealth bought skill and steel. And countless innocent souls were crushed beneath the weight of a ritual that, for all its lofty invocations of divine intervention, was governed more by human muscle than by the breath of angels. Still, the medieval world clung fiercely to these combats, unable or unwilling to abandon a belief system that tied every swing of the sword to the will of the heavens. So the fields bore witness again and again, soaking up the sweat and fear of men who stood as proxies for their loved ones' honor or their patrons' fortunes. Trumpets would sound, blades would clash, prayers would rise to join the dust. When at last the fighting stilled and one figure crumpled to the earth, the verdict was clear. The crowd would murmur solemnly, accepting without question that justice had been served by the hand that wielded the sharper blade, and by extension, by the mysterious, often merciless hand of God. Among the many dark corridors of medieval justice, few were as narrow and airless as those reserved for women.
Their lives were already bound by strict expectations that defined virtue, obedience, and modesty as the highest markers of female worth. But when accusations arose, whether whispered slanders of adultery, rumors of poisoning, disputes over inheritance, or even petty quarrels twisted into charges of scolding, the machinery of the law turned with a weight that bore down on them in ways men rarely faced. In these dim places where judgment was rendered, women's fates were entangled like fragile threads in a loom, overseen by hands both earthly and divine, hands that seemed all too eager to tug those threads until they snapped. Imagine a rough patch of ground in the center of a small village, ringed by villagers who had come not merely out of curiosity, but with a fervor that was half dread, half relish. At the center stands a woman, sometimes young, sometimes careworn with the years, stripped to her shift, waist deep in a hole dug just for this grim purpose. This was the so-called judicial pit, a cruel adaptation meant to level the odds when a woman was forced by custom or by the insistence of her accuser to prove her innocence through direct combat. The pit pinned her to one spot, reducing her mobility, ensuring she could not easily flee or evade. She would be handed a simple weapon, perhaps a cloth-wrapped stone, while the man who stood at the edge wielded a stout club or staff. The theory behind this barbaric arrangement was that it balanced male strength with the woman's limited footing, a grotesque parody of fairness.
Villagers stood hushed as the struggle commenced. Blows landed, sharp cries cut the air, and the crowd would shift and sway as if their collective bodies might somehow lessen the impact. If the woman failed, crumpling under the man's strikes, it was taken as a sign of guilt. If by some desperate miracle she won, by wounding her opponent until he yielded, her innocence was proclaimed not through logic or evidence, but by sheer survival. Yet even then, she carried the marks of the ordeal home, her body bruised, her spirit likely fractured by the knowledge that divine justice had demanded she fight like a cornered animal to prove her purity. Not all trials demanded combat, but many devised their own peculiar torments for women, tailored to the supposed failings most feared in them. The scold's bridle, for instance, was a cage of iron bars and cruel spikes that enclosed a woman's head, sometimes fitted with a flat plate that pressed down on her tongue. This device was reserved for those deemed too sharp-tongued or too quick to challenge their husbands or neighbors. Forced to wear it through the streets, the condemned woman became a living spectacle of shame, unable even to plead her case or protest her humiliation. Townspeople often followed behind, jeering, pelting her with filth, reinforcing a lesson more powerful than any official decree. A woman who spoke too freely threatened the delicate social order. There were other punishments just as invasive, their cruelty sharpened by a meticulous attention to symbolism. Adulteresses might be marched naked through the streets, or forced to wear garments turned inside out, their hair cut raggedly to broadcast dishonor to all who saw them. A woman convicted of theft might lose a hand or be branded on her cheek, her flesh forever bearing witness to transgressions that society seemed eager never to forget. In every one of these rituals, the punishment was more than mere penalty. It was an act of public theater, reinforcing to all who watched that a woman's body was both the canvas of her guilt and the tool by which her community would exact its vengeance. Yet woven through these harsh customs was a thread of dark paradox. The same courts that so zealously punished women also often placed their virtue on a pedestal, decreeing that female honor was a communal treasure to be guarded at almost any cost. A wife's infidelity was treated not just as her personal failing, but as a stain on her husband's name and a potential threat to property lines. For how could inheritance proceed cleanly if children were not truly his? Thus, trials and punishments targeted women with a fervor that revealed deep anxieties about lineage, ownership, and the fragile foundations of feudal wealth and alliance. Clerics and local judges, almost always men, justified these measures by appealing to divine order. They quoted scripture to underline a woman's duty to be silent and obedient, to bear her burdens with humility. In their eyes, the harsh discipline meted out by secular and ecclesiastical courts was not cruelty but necessary correction, a painful medicine to restore harmony. Villagers absorbed these lessons, passing them from mother to daughter in cautionary tales that began long before any girl found herself accused. Perhaps most chilling of all was the quiet complicity that often surrounded these punishments. Neighbors might stand by as a woman was led through the streets in chains, offering no comfort. Families, terrified of sharing her disgrace, sometimes turned their faces away, hoping distance might preserve their own fragile standing. In this world, a woman alone before the law was truly alone, bereft of the networks of protection that wealth or powerful kin might afford, and wholly at the mercy of a system eager to prove that order could be maintained only by keeping certain voices low and certain bodies under relentless watch. In the dark ledger of medieval justice, these punishments for women stand out not just for their physical cruelty, but for the way they targeted the deepest fibers of identity, dignity, reputation, the right to speak, even the right to move freely in one's own skin. And though centuries now lie like soft dust over the memories of these cruel spectacles, their echoes linger, reminding us that law is never just about written codes and official verdicts. It is also about the silent agreements of communities, the fears they choose to name, and the deep, often unspoken bargains struck between power and vulnerability. In medieval Europe, those bargains weighed heavily on women, binding them with fragile, invisible threads that could tighten into nooses the moment suspicion took root in the hearts of those who stood watching. Beyond the city gates, where the neatly cobbled streets gave way to muddy tracks and the air grew thick with the scent of dung, smoke, and damp earth, lived men whose names were rarely spoken above a whisper. Their houses stood slightly apart, their doors often marked not by official decree, but by the quiet agreement of the townspeople who preferred a buffer of open ground between themselves and these necessary, unsettling figures. These were the executioners, the hands of the law's final, irrevocable judgment, the ones who ended disputes with a swing of the axe or a tightening of the noose. They occupied a place in medieval life that was both indispensable and deeply contaminated, a strange twilight existence caught between revulsion and reluctant respect.
To the medieval mind, there was something unclean about the plying of death. A man who regularly cut short another's breath, who severed heads from shoulders or guided the trembling steps of the condemned up the scaffold, carried an invisible taint. No matter how lawful his actions, no matter that he performed them at the explicit command of magistrates or even kings, the work itself was thought to stain his soul and his very touch. People feared that some spiritual contagion might cling to his skin, slip beneath their own, and invite misfortune. Thus, executioners were forced to live on the margins, their homes often located beyond the protective ring of city walls. Markets might refuse them entry altogether, or allow them to buy food only if they avoided touching the wares. In some places, special sticks were provided so they could point to the bread or vegetables they wished to purchase without risk of contamination. Tavern keepers served them last, carefully washing down tables and cups after they departed. Even their children bore the burden of this inherited dread. Other youngsters shunned them, wary of invisible curses that might leap from family to family. Yet the paradox that marked so many aspects of medieval life cut deep here too. For these same men, shunned and whispered about, were often sought out in secret and entrusted with the most intimate hopes of survival. The executioner was frequently also the town's most experienced healer. He understood anatomy better than most surgeons, for he had handled countless bodies, cut through muscle and sinew, cracked open bones. This grim familiarity with the human frame meant he knew how to set a splintered limb, how to lance a festering boil, how to stitch a wound so it might close cleanly rather than rot. Families who would never have invited him to supper would nonetheless slip out of town under cover of night to knock on his door, desperate for his help when a fever raged or a deep cut refused to mend. Inside his dim house, smelling of herbs, old blood, and the sour tang of fear, the executioner would mix poultices, boil iron instruments, and murmur advice that might save a life. Many kept collections of odd tools and jars of preserved substances. Fat from hanged men, believed by some to ease arthritis. Powdered bones, dried flowers gathered from grave sites. All part of a shadowy pharmacopoeia that mixed folk tradition with the stark, practical knowledge born of his grim profession.
And so it was that the same hand that guided the executioner's blade by day might apply soothing salves by lantern light. Villagers, haunted by the contradictory emotions of horror and gratitude, often paid for such services in coins pressed hesitantly into his palm, or else with goods left on his doorstep at dawn. They rarely met his eyes, quick to scurry away once their need was met. This dual role granted the executioner a peculiar sort of power. Though despised in public, he was also feared in ways that extended beyond his office. People whispered that a man so close to death might command spirits or carry curses in his breath. Mothers scolded children who strayed too near his house, warning that a careless insult might earn them a wasting sickness. Yet when a beloved uncle coughed blood into his handkerchief, or a child's leg twisted unnaturally beneath the weight of a falling beam, these same families found themselves swallowing their superstitions and seeking the executioner's door. It was a lonely existence, weighted by contradictions. Within city councils and lordly courts, officials recognized the executioner's indispensable function. They paid him wages, often granted him a modest estate just outside the walls, and sometimes even promised protection should aggrieved families of the condemned seek vengeance. But this official sanction did little to soften his isolation. Invitations to festivals or weddings rarely came. Neighbors crossed themselves if he passed by. Even the church often held him at arm's length, reluctant to allow him burial in consecrated ground without heavy donations or special dispensation. Perhaps the most haunting truth lay in how these men, so skilled at unmaking life, grew to value its fragile continuance. Accounts survive of executioners who treated the poor free of charge, or who argued before magistrates for clemency when they suspected guilt was uncertain. Their lives sat constantly on the knife's edge between the dark duty of ending breath and the hopeful labor of restoring it. In them, the medieval world's tangled views of justice, sin, and mercy found their starkest expression. Thus, the executioner remained ever apart, dwelling beyond the walls in small homes often marked by shutters kept closed tight against prying eyes. To some, his house was a place of nightmares, the dark lair of a man who trafficked daily with the final unknowable transition. To others, it was a last refuge when all else failed, a humble sanctuary where the tools of death might paradoxically turn back death's hand for a little while longer. In his solitary figure, we see reflected the medieval conviction that purity and corruption, salvation and ruin often grew from the same soil, tended by the same troubled, necessary hands.
Through the bustling lanes of medieval towns, past stalls crowded with bolts of bright wool, baskets of onions, glinting knives, and jars of sweetmeats, there lay another stage, one more somber than any lively market square, yet always placed precisely where the greatest number of passers-by might witness its grim lessons. It was here, on wide flagstones worn smooth by countless feet, that debtors found themselves exposed not merely to the pitiless sun or the sting of cold air, but to the sharpest blade their neighbors possessed, public contempt. In an age where community bonds formed the bedrock of survival,
where a man's reputation was his currency long before silver crossed palms, to fall behind on debts was to tumble into an abyss lined with shame. Owing money did not only signal financial misfortune, it marked you as unreliable, a crack in the delicate weave of trust that held together villages and boroughs. And so, medieval towns devised punishments that did more than reclaim coin. They sought to brand dishonor across the debtor's very skin. Imagine stepping into the square early on a festival day. Banners flutter overhead, musicians tune rustic pipes, and the scent of roasting meat drifts temptingly across the cobblestones. But near the well or by the steps of the Guildhall, the crowd thins into a curious ring. At its center sits a man, or sometimes a woman, stripped nearly bare. His clothes, humble though they may have been taken from him as a deliberate part of the sentence, leaving him half naked under the gazes of those he once called neighbors. A collar of iron might lock about his neck, or his ankles be secured by rough stocks that forced him to crouch uncomfortably, exposed and defenseless. Passers-by pause. Children stare wide-eyed until mothers tug them along, whispering warnings about honesty and thrift. Merchants who once trusted this unfortunate soul with goods on credit now shake their heads, clucking tongues at the sorry sight. Meanwhile, perched in this humiliating tableau, the debtor must beg aloud for relief, imploring not some distant judge, but the very people he once greeted in warm familiarity. Coins might be tossed his way, either in genuine pity or to hasten the spectacle's end, for only when enough was gathered could he buy back a semblance of dignity. Until then, each hour stretched like a cruel joke, a living reminder that one standing in the community balanced precariously on the ability to settle accounts.
These scenes were common enough to become part of the ordinary social fabric. Town ordinances often spelled out in careful, looping script precisely how such punishments should unfold. In some regions, a debtor might be required to sit upon a low, crude stool, head bowed, a placard hanging about his neck that detailed the sum owed and to whom. Elsewhere, more theatrical humiliations thrived. The debtor might be forced to wear a tunic inside out, signaling a life turned askew by reckless promises. Crowds rarely failed to assemble. For them, these displays were cautionary dramas, reinforcing the fragile but vital consensus that allowed trust to oil the wheels of commerce and cooperation. Yet within these rituals of disgrace lay deeper, more human wounds. Debt often crept upon a household like a slow fever. A failed harvest, an illness that kept strong hands from the fields, a dowry promised for a daughter's marriage, all could tip a family into obligations they could not honor. And once drawn into this downward spiral, climbing free became painfully difficult. Merchants demanded harsh interest. Neighbors grew wary of offering even small loans, fearful of sharing in the contagion of insolvency. Thus, the debtor, seated on cold stone, limbs trembling either from chill or shame, became an embodiment of collective anxieties. Villagers needed to see him there, needed the ritual stripping of respectability, so they might reassure themselves that moral order was still intact, that ruin came to those who failed their communal obligations, not to the upright who labored hard and paid what they owed. For the debtor himself, the punishment often stretched far beyond the hours endured in public exposure. Once released, he carried an invisible mark, one just as lasting as any brand seared onto flesh. Former friends might avert their eyes in the market, reluctant to greet him lest his disgrace rub off. Creditors would tighten their terms or refuse him altogether. Merchants calculating that generosity toward a proven defaulter was an invitation to share his downfall. Gossip filled the gaps left by fact, embellishing his faults, inventing vices to explain the poverty that had found him. Still, communities remained paradoxically bound to these same figures they shamed.
A town could not afford to lose too many of its laborers or tradesmen. Over time, many debtors clawed their way back into cautious acceptance, helped perhaps by relatives who settled their accounts, or by a series of small, careful bargains that slowly rebuilt a tarnished reputation. The memory of that day in the square, however, never fully faded. It hung about them like a faint, persistent odor, coloring every future promise with an undertone of suspicion.
And so, public punishment for debts was more than an exercise in cruelty. It was a ritual of communal reassurance. It dramatized the fragile rules that bound neighbors together in trust, rules that insisted debts be paid not just in coin, but in personal honor, displayed for all to see. By forcing the debtor to sit in shame, half-naked under the collective gaze, medieval society reaffirmed its deepest conviction, that reputation was as essential to survival as bread or shelter, and those who endangered the delicate balance of mutual faith would pay, if not in flesh, then most certainly in spirit. In the crowded lanes of medieval towns, where brightly striped awnings shaded heaps of onions, bundles of herbs, and glistening pots of meat, the marketplace was far more than a simple hub of buying and selling. It was the very heartbeat of community life, a place where gossip flowed as freely as coins, where alliances formed over handshakes and rivalries flared over sidelong glances at another merchant's stall. In such a charged atmosphere, trust was not just convenient, it was essential. A market that could not guarantee honesty in weights and measures, in the quality of ale or the freshness of bread, was a place where the delicate threads holding society together began to fray. Thus, medieval communities guarded their markets with ferocity. Town charters spelled out exacting standards for everything from the size of a loaf to the composition of beer. Inspectors, sometimes appointed by local guilds or councils, patrolled the bustling rows with scales and rods, lifting lids, sniffing barrels, pinching bread crusts between practiced fingers. The smallest fraud was a crime not only against the individual buyer, but against the moral compact that allowed neighbors to trust one another in matters of daily survival. And so when deceit was uncovered, a baker found substituting husk and chalk for flour, or a brewer caught diluting ale with water drawn from murky streams, punishment was swift, public, and crafted to sting in more ways than one. It was not enough that the guilty pay a fine. The sentence had to satisfy the crowd's thirst for visible restitution and reaffirmed that deception would not be allowed to fester among honest folk. Picture a market square on a busy morning. The air brims with the cries of hawkers and the bleating of goats led to slaughter. Then, above it all, comes the clanging of a small bell, the unmistakable summons to gather for judgment. Townspeople press together, baskets forgotten, eager to witness a bit of rough theater. At the center stands the offending baker or brewer, stripped of the anonymity he once enjoyed behind his stall. His offense is proclaimed by a crier in ringing tones, leaving no doubt in the minds of his customers, past or future, exactly how he has betrayed their trust. Then comes the punishment, devised with a certain grim creativity that might be called poetic, if not exactly merciful. A dishonest baker could be tied to a cart and paraded through the streets, holding aloft the very loaf that betrayed him, a dense gray slab of underweight bread for all to mock. Children dart alongside, pointing and jeering. Adults follow with muttered condemnations or gleeful laughter, pleased to see the scales balanced in such vivid fashion. The brewer fared no better. Caught watering down ale, he might be forced to sit inside a great barrel, often one of his own, which was then wheeled through the streets, sloshing with sour remnants. In some places, it was customary to dunk the culprit repeatedly into a trough or pond, soaking his clothes and dignity alike under the approving cheers of onlookers who relished the sharp taste of justice delivered with an almost festive cruelty. These punishments served multiple purposes. They satisfied the immediate appetite for retribution among those who felt cheated, delivering humiliation as a public spectacle that cautioned others against similar deceit.
They also functioned as powerful reminders that the seemingly simple act of buying bread or beer was underpinned by a vast, unwritten agreement of mutual trust. To break that agreement was to threaten the prosperity and cohesion of the entire town, inviting economic turmoil and social discord. Yet there was another layer still, a psychological one. By forcing the guilty to literally embody their crime, clutching the evidence of their dishonesty for all to see, the punishment wove the offense into their very person. A baker parading his shame loaf or a brewer bobbing in his own tainted barrel could never again fully separate himself from his misdeed. Long after fines were paid and days of public ridicule had ended, whispers would follow him through the market. Hands might withdraw from his offered wares. Neighbors might reconsider inviting him to festive gatherings. For all the harshness of these spectacles, medieval communities viewed them not merely as punitive, but as necessary correctives that helped restore moral equilibrium. Better to endure a day of scorn and emerge chastened than to fester in hidden deceit, risking worse for everyone. In this way, the marketplace was kept whole not just by laws scribbled in dusty ledgers, but by a living, breathing ritual of communal oversight, where trust was defended with equal measures of mockery and menace. Thus the medieval square, so full of laughter, quarrels, songs, and the rich aromas of roasting meat, also carried within it the ever-present possibility of disgrace. Beneath the colorful canopies, amid baskets of apples and bolts of cloth, hovered the silent warning that to cheat one's fellows was to invite a reckoning, one that would not unfold behind closed doors, but under the bright, pitiless sun, in the very heart of the world one had tried to deceive. And so, day after day, honest merchants called out their wares with proud clarity, hoping each transaction would fortify the fragile web of trust that made life in those crowded streets not just possible, but bearable.
In the grand halls of lords and bishops, where torchlight shimmered across polished wood and flickered along the edges of brightly colored tapestries, meals unfolded like theatrical performances, lavish displays of wealth and power, orchestrated down to the last gilded platter. Guests reclined on cushioned benches, while servants bustled to and fro, bearing trenchers piled high with marvels that seemed more like conjuring tricks than humble nourishment. Whole peacocks arrived at table, their dazzling feathers reattached after roasting, so they perched on silver dishes as if merely pausing mid-strut. Pies cracked open to release live songbirds that flapped, bewildered, through rafters heavy with smoke. Sculpted sugar castles glittered alongside candied fruits arranged to look like jeweled trees. Such feasts were more than gluttony. They were declarations of might, calculated spectacles that reminded everyone, from lesser nobles to visiting merchants, exactly who controlled the land, the harvests, and, by extension, the very ability to eat well or starve. To dine under such a roof was to submit, even as you smiled and clapped at each new marvel, to the hierarchy that governed every breath of medieval life. Yet behind this glittering pageant lay the darker reality, even for those who presided over it. The very abundance that filled these tables carried dangers as insidious as any dagger drawn in courtly intrigue. Rich foods clogged bodies unaccustomed to moderation. Gout, known then as the disease of kings, twisted noble joints, leaving them hobbling on canes or confined to bed. Fevers swept through households bloated by too much meat and spiced wine, their stomachs fertile ground for all manner of lurking maladies. Physicians, with their potions of ground emerald or theriac made from snake flesh, could promise little relief. And so banquets that began with laughter and clinking goblets sometimes ended with shrouds and softly closed chapel doors. Meanwhile, far from these glowing hearths, in dim cottages strung along muddy tracks, peasants gathered around rough wooden bowls filled with meals that barely deserved the name. Their daily fare was a thin gruel of oats or barley,
sometimes bolstered by bits of onion or leeks pulled from small garden plots. Bread, that most essential staff of life, often stretched with ground bones, bark, or even clay when harvests failed or taxes bit too deep. Such adulterations were both necessity and quiet humiliation, grim reminders that the land they tilled rarely rewarded them with enough to comfortably feed their own. For them, eating was not ceremony, but anxious calculation. Would the stores last until the next harvest? Could a rabbit snared in the hedgerow be hidden from the game warden's fines? Might a neighbor share a few salted herrings in exchange for help repairing a collapsed roof? Every mouthful carried the faint taste of worry, even in seasons of modest plenty. In lean years, meals shrank to barely more than warm water, scented with whatever scraps could be spared. Bellies ached not from excess, but from the slow gnaw of days spent working on empty stomachs.
Food in the medieval world thus stood at a crossroads of awe and peril for every class. For nobles, it was a weapon of prestige, yet also a source of physical frailty that no fortress walls could keep at bay. For commoners, it was a daily uncertainty, a test of ingenuity and endurance that might determine whether their children saw another spring. Disease knew no boundaries of rank. Spoiled meat, tainted wells, or outbreaks of grain mold could devastate a village or slip undetected into the larders of castles, reminding all that death and hunger did not respect titles. Even within churches, where monks and nuns took vows of humility, food became both blessing and temptation. Strict rules governed fasting and feasting alike, with calendars bristling with saints' days that alternately forbade and encouraged richer fare. In some monasteries, the tension broke through in secret indulgences, illicit wheels of cheese or hidden flasks of spiced wine tucked away behind cold stone walls. Tales spread of abbots who turned cellars into private banqueting chambers, their tables laid out in quiet defiance of pious restraint. Yet woven through this precarious tapestry was also the fragile joy that food could bring. A festival day, even in the poorest hamlet, meant a shared loaf made with a little extra flour, a pot of stew thickened with a neighbor's carrot or sprig of savory. Children laughed, faces smeared with honey, chasing each other beneath garlands of wilted flowers. For an evening at least, the specter of hunger retreated. In this way, the medieval table, whether weighed down by peacock feathers or scratched by coarse wooden spoons, was never merely about sustenance. It was a stage where power strutted, where fear crept in unbidden, where tiny triumphs lit up worn faces. Each bite carried the flavor of class and fate, of fleeting security or looming want, binding all who ate into a grand, uneasy fellowship under the shadow of the same uncertain sun. When fields lay bare beneath a sun that burned cruelly, or clouds that refused to break, when granaries stood echoingly empty, and the thin, anxious cattle picked at brown, withered stubble, the carefully constructed edifice of medieval order began to buckle. Laws, so meticulously drafted and enforced in seasons of abundance, lost their iron grip when hunger gnawed its relentless way into every household. In such desperate times, the lines that separated neighbor from neighbor, morality from crime, even human from beast, blurred until they vanished entirely beneath the grinding wheel of need.
The early 14th century saw the most harrowing example in what came to be called simply the Great Famine. Years of torrential rains drowned the crops, rotted the seed in sodden ground, and swept away topsoil. Roads turned to rivers of muck, trade faltered, and local markets withered. Starvation seeped into the villages first, tightening its fingers around the poorest who had no stores to fall back on. Then it crept through towns, up the winding lanes to the doors of craftsmen and lesser merchants. Even modestly comfortable households found themselves boiling shoe leather for broth, or scouring hedgerows for bitter greens that offered scant nourishment. As bellies hollowed and children's cries weakened to pitiful whimpers, the bonds of community, so crucial to medieval survival, began to splinter. Where once villagers gathered to judge a dishonest baker or console a grieving widow, now they eyed each other with suspicion and envy. A man who tucked away a few precious grains might awake to find his small hoard stolen, his barn doors hacked apart with crude axes. Those who could afford armed guards hired them. Those who could not watched their modest possessions vanish under cover of darkness. Then came the stories that even hardened chroniclers recorded with evident horror. Parents abandoning their children along forest paths when they could no longer bear to hear them beg for food. Corpses stripped not only of valuables but of flesh, in scenes so bleak they seemed ripped from the mouths of demons rather than human memory. Though clerics thundered from pulpits about the sanctity of life and the damnation awaiting such acts, starvation was a teacher that mocked every sermon. The law, which once stood like a sturdy wall around society, crumbled into useless rubble under the weight of empty stomachs. No sooner had the land begun to inch its way toward recovery than another, more sinister scourge arrived: plague. The Black Death swept across Europe with a swiftness that seemed almost supernatural. Its arrival was heralded by a silence that fell on towns as carts rolled through streets collecting the still bodies of yesterday's neighbors. Laws, whether concerning trade, property, or public morality, meant little when half a community lay in hastily dug trenches outside its own walls. Fear trumped every statute. Whole villages locked their gates against travelers who might bring infection, even when those travelers were kin begging for sanctuary. Officials tasked with enforcing market weights or adjudicating field disputes often disappeared themselves, sequestered behind shuttered doors, or else laid low by the very sickness they sought to control. In some places, local governance dissolved entirely, replaced by the grim arithmetic of survival.
The psychological shock fractured minds already weakened by loss. Religious processions, once dignified affairs marked by careful pageantry, turned into frenzied marches of flagellants who whipped themselves raw in hopes of appeasing divine wrath. Elsewhere, people threw off every restraint, plunging into wild feasts and drunken revelry under the dark logic that death stalked them regardless, so why not drain every cup and break every taboo before it struck? Under such conditions, the medieval world's intricate web of obligations, from vassal to lord, from tenant to landholder, from guild brother to fellow craftsman, tangled beyond repair. Customary dues went unpaid, contracts were ignored. Who could demand a tithe of brain when there was no grain to be had? Who dared collect fines from a household ringed by the smell of sickness? Some local lords tried to enforce old norms with brutal resolve, sending armed men to seize livestock or drag peasants before makeshift courts, but these efforts often sparked violent backlash. Starving people, with nothing left to lose, could become more dangerous than any organized army. And in this chaos, darker instincts surfaced. Records, sparse and trembling, as if the scribes feared even to set such truths to parchment, hint at episodes of cannibalism. Entire families vanished into forests and mountains, fleeing not just plague or tax collectors, but the thin, sharp knives of neighbors who might decide that the only remaining meat worth harvesting walked on 2 feet. Priests recorded confessions from hollow-eyed penitents who spoke of pots simmering with horrors no one dared name aloud. In the face of such raw desperation, the law became little more than a distant memory. Statutes inked onto fine vellum purled into irrelevance beside the hard calculus of hunger and terror. Judges who once presided over bustling chambers found themselves seated in empty halls, or else fled with their families, abandoning the very towns they were meant to safeguard. Meanwhile, the people who remained picked over abandoned fields, crept through the homes of the dead, and prayed, to saints, to relics, sometimes to any power that might hear, for mercy that never seemed to come. Yet even in these darkest chapters, life stubbornly crawled on. Fields eventually greened once more, children were born to replace the countless lost. New contracts were written where old ones had been torn by famine and plague. But the memory of those bleak years lingered like a bruise deep beneath the skin of Europe, a reminder that under enough strain, all the carefully stacked laws and moral certainties of medieval society could tumble into ruin. And in that ruin, the true fragility of human order and the terrifying resilience of human desperation was laid bare for all to see.
If medieval life was a vast, unpredictable sea, rocked by famines, plagues, and the constant undercurrent of human ambition, then the Church was the lighthouse that promised to steady the course, shining beams of moral certainty and sacred order over waters otherwise dark with fear. Nowhere did this guiding influence press more deeply into daily existence than in matters of food and the soul, binding kitchens and hearts alike to an intricate web of divine expectations. Throughout every village and town, from stone chapels on lonely hills to grand cathedrals that dwarfed city squares, the Church's voice rose to set the rhythm of the table as much as it did of prayer. The calendar itself became a careful dance between feast and fast, woven through with holy days that dictated not merely when one should bow the head, but what could be placed upon the plate. During Lent, Advent, and countless lesser vigils, believers were commanded to abstain from rich foods, meat foremost among them, sometimes eggs and dairy as well, turning the diet sparse, a deliberate echo of Christ's own hunger in the wilderness. Fish thus swam eagerly into medieval menus, from humble salted herring in peasant cottages to elaborate dishes of lamprey gracing noble banquets, layered in spices that might almost disguise the penance. These restrictions were not simply about obedience for its own sake. They were moral training, tangible reminders that the body's appetites must yield to higher purpose. To deny oneself a roast goose or a fragrant cheese was to discipline the flesh, to purify longing so that it might better rise heavenward. Parish priests preached often on the dangers of gluttony, ranking it among the deadliest snares of the soul, not just because it threatened the belly with disease, but because it revealed a spirit unable to curb its desires. Yet the Church's hold over food extended well beyond individual virtue. Ecclesiastical courts could and did prosecute those who flouted fasts too brazenly, levying penances that might range from fines to humiliating public admissions of guilt. Tavern keepers and bakers faced inspections not only by civic officials, but sometimes by clerical overseers, eager to ensure that what the community consumed did not become a stumbling block to salvation. Even the humble parish ale was caught in this moral net. Drunkenness, after all, was a well-trodden road to other vices, and local priests took a keen interest in ensuring the line between cheerful celebration and sinful excess remained visible. But the story of the Church and medieval eating was not one only of scolding and restriction. Monasteries and abbeys often stood as islands of mercy in times when hunger prowled the countryside. Their gardens and fish ponds fed not just robed brothers and sisters, but entire communities in lean seasons. Alms were distributed from heavy wooden tables, bowls of pottage handed to lines of villagers whose own cupboards had long run bare. Bread baked in cavernous kitchens was carried by novices through frost-bitten streets, delivered to doorsteps where families huddled, whispering prayers of thanks not just to God, but to these human hands that did His work. And then there were luminous figures like Hildegard of Bingen, a woman who defied many of her age's quiet expectations. As an abbess, she governed not only the spiritual lives of her sisters, but also the very rhythms of their meals and medicines. In her writings, food appears again and again, not merely as sustenance, but as a tool of divine balance. Hildegard spoke of the humors that coursed through flesh, the green energy, viriditas, that animated all living things. She counseled moderation, yes, but also celebrated the joyous gifts of the earth. Spelt that strengthened the body without burdening it, fennel that soothed digestion, even wine taken in right measure to lift spirits rather than drown them. Under her guidance, the convent was a place where discipline did not crush delight,
but refined it into something almost sacred. In this way, the Church's regulation of food and morality was profoundly double-edged. Its strictures could feel like chains, yoking believers to endless rules about what might pass their lips and when. Yet it also provided a framework that lent meaning to sacrifice, turning empty tables in winter into offerings that mirrored holy fasting, transforming even the smallest denial into a thread in the vast tapestry of cosmic redemption. When famine struck, when neighbors starved and barns echoed hollow, the abbey doors often remained open, sturdy stone embracing the shivering masses who found bread and broth within. Monks and nuns might intone psalms as they ladled stew into waiting hands, blending nourishment of body and soul in humble bowls that smoked against cold air. Thus, the medieval landscape was one where the clanging of church bells signaled not just hours for prayer, but the rise and fall of spoons, the closing of larders, and the opening of cloisters. Under this watchful guidance, meals became more than simple acts of feeding. They were small daily reckonings with temptation and gratitude, occasions to measure one's heart as much as one's hunger. And in rare, bright figures like Hildegard, this complex relationship found its gentlest expression, proof that in a world so often overshadowed by scarcity and fear, holiness could still dwell at the hearth as readily as at the altar, whispering that to eat wisely and joyfully was itself a kind of praise.
Beneath the vaulted ceilings of cathedrals and inside the smoky, timbered halls of manors, medieval society rested on a story so simple in its telling that it seemed almost divinely ordained. It was a story repeated by priests in their sermons, by chroniclers scratching lines onto vellum, by village elders gathered around low hearths after long days in the fields. The world was made of 3 orders, each appointed by God to fulfill a specific, indispensable purpose. There were those who prayed, those who fought, and those who worked, oratores, bellatores, laboratores. In these neat divisions lay not just a convenient explanation of social reality, but the very scaffolding by which kings, bishops, and lords upheld their power. At the top of this sacred pyramid stood the clergy, those who pray. They were the shepherds of souls, the gatekeepers of salvation who interceded daily with heaven on behalf of all below. Whether robed in the humble brown of wandering friars or draped in the jewel-crusted vestments of bishops seated upon cathedral thrones, their authority was profound, woven through every birth, marriage, death, and hope for forgiveness. Their hands lifted chalices and offered blessings, but they also penned decrees, levied tithes, and interpreted divine will in ways that subtly, persistently shaped the laws of kingdoms. Just below them in this celestial architecture stood the knights and nobles, those who fight. They were charged with the protection of Christendom's lands and peoples, bound by oaths of fealty that linked sprawling estates and stone keeps into an intricate web of allegiance. Their gleaming mail and banners emblazoned with family sigils offered a stirring spectacle, but beyond this pageantry lay a system deeply practical and ruthlessly enforced. In exchange for their loyalty and readiness to draw steel at a lord's summons, they received vast tracts of land, the labor of peasants, and the legal right to levy rents and justice alike. Theirs was a life structured by tournaments, campaigns, and the quiet grind of estate management that funded it all.
And beneath these 2 lofty estates, grounding the entire edifice, toiled the overwhelming majority, those who work. Peasants plowed narrow strips of land, sowed barley and rye, tended sheep on wind-swept hillsides. They built roads, brewed ale, mended shoes, carted loads of firewood, and quarried the stone that raised the very cathedrals under whose arches they knelt. In them resided the unspoken truth of the system. Their sweat was the coin by which the prayers of monks and the feasting of knights were purchased. This threefold order was not merely a convenient snapshot of social roles. It was underpinned by law and fiercely defended by custom. Sumptuary regulations dictated who could wear certain fabrics or adorn themselves with precious metals, ensuring that even outward appearances reaffirmed the divisions. Legal codes cemented privileges. Clerics often answered only to ecclesiastical courts, shielded from secular penalties. Nobles wielded the power to hold courts on their own lands, dispensing judgment that rarely threatened their own estates. Meanwhile, the peasant, bound by feudal dues, found few avenues to contest the taxes or labors demanded of him. For those at the top, this arrangement offered more than economic advantage. It provided a comforting ideology. By framing society's tiers as reflections of divine intention, resistance could be branded not simply as rebellion against earthly overlords, but as a dangerous heresy, a shaking of the very ladder by which souls might climb towards salvation. Priests preached that all stations were appointed by God, that to challenge one's place was to dispute heaven's design. Knights extolled chivalric codes that cloaked their privileges in the language of duty and protection, even as they exacted heavy tolls from those they claimed to guard. And for the common laborer, taught from cradle to grave that his sweat pleased God by maintaining the great chain of being, there were few tools to imagine a world otherwise. In moments of deep scarcity or cruelty, resentment might simmer, even erupt into local revolts, swiftly crushed. But more often, life continued along the grooves worn deep by generations. The very laws that preserved these divisions were tangled into contracts of marriage, inheritance, market rights, and tithes, ensuring that even small acts of daily survival pulled the peasant back into the orbit of lord and priest.
Yet within this rigid framework lay a certain grim stability. Everyone knew their duties, their expected deference, their slim share of privileges. The system did not rely on constant violence to sustain itself, for ideology did much of the work. Sermons, ceremonies, and colorful pageantry wove these roles into the marrow of people's identities. The fields fed the castles and monasteries, the monasteries blessed the fields, the castles protected, or claimed to protect, both. Thus life rolled forward under banners and bells, each estate watching the others with a wary respect that never quite hid the underlying tensions. In the end, the genius of this tripartite order was how thoroughly it folded power into the fabric of faith and daily habit. To question why a wealthy knight should feast while a plowman's children starved was not only to risk a noble's wrath, but to seem to doubt God's inscrutable plan. Laws did more than enforce dues and settle disputes. They enshrined a hierarchy that was said to echo the very hierarchy of angels, stretching from humble seraphs to the almighty throne. And so the ladder remained, its rungs worn smooth by countless hands, some raised in prayer, some gripping sword hilts, most curled around plow handles, each convinced or compelled to play their ordained part in this grand, immovable design. In the delicate architecture of medieval society, status was not merely a matter of wealth or ancestry. It was a rigid skeleton underpinning every breath and gesture, shaping what a person could eat, how they might speak, and even what dreams they were permitted to entertain. Laws were drafted not simply to keep the peace or protect property, but to uphold this intricate hierarchy by regulating desire itself, making sure that even the faintest aspirations of the lower orders never reached too far beyond their appointed station. Perhaps nowhere was this more vividly on display than in the realm of clothing. To modernize, a gown is a gown, a tunic, varying mainly by taste or purse. But in the medieval mind, garments were woven with far more than thread. They carried unmistakable signals of rank, the warp and weft tangled with expectation and threat. Sumptuary laws spelled out in meticulous detail who might wear what fabrics, colors, or adornments. Velvet and silk were reserved for nobles, their shimmering folds broadcasting privilege from across a crowded hall. Certain rich dyes, like deep scarlets or royal purples, were effectively forbidden to commoners, who risked heavy fines or public disgrace should they dare to don them. Imagine a miller's daughter who, struck by vanity or a fleeting wish to feel lovely beyond her means, spends her hard-earned coins on a scrap of silk ribbon. Perhaps she winds it through her hair on market day,
hoping to catch an admiring glance. Such a small indulgence could draw the sharp eyes of local officials or a priest eager to preserve moral order. She might be summoned, chastised, her ribbon seized, a tiny luxury crushed under the great boot of social preservation. The message was clear. Beauty that dared to mimic the nobilities was a form of rebellion, an affront to a world carefully tiered by divine and human decree. It went beyond clothing. The hunt, too, was carefully fenced off by law and custom. Noblemen roamed vast forests with hawks on gloved wrists and sleek hounds bounding ahead, taking pleasure and prestige alike from the chase. But woe to the peasant who dared to snare a hare in those same woods, or loose an arrow at a deer that might, by legal fiction, belong to his lord's table even before the shaft flew. Poaching was not merely theft, it was a dangerous assertion of equality, an unspoken claim that one might stand alongside the gentry in savoring the thrill of pursuit and the richness of game. Thus, punishments were severe: maiming, ruinous fines, or years bound to hard labor, all to remind the lowly that ambition had very real boundaries. Nowhere, however, did the law intrude more painfully into private hopes than in marriage. Among peasants, unions often reflected simple survival needs, consolidating fields, securing a sturdy pair of hands for the farm, paying off debts through a daughter's dowry. In countless villages, young women learned early that their hearts mattered less than the silent calculations of fathers and brothers. Bargains were struck over mugs of ale, with a cow or a plot of barley land changing hands to seal the fate of a girl who might be barely past her first bleeding years. Take the story of Agnes, recorded in a faded parish account from a Midland shire. Her father, burdened by debts after 2 failed harvests, promised her to a widower 3 times her age in exchange for forgiving what he owed. On the day of her binding, she wept so bitterly that onlookers remarked she seemed like one already laid in her grave. Yet the transaction was perfectly legal, even blessed by the priest who pressed her hand into that of her new husband. Under the law, consent was a shadowy thing, easily overshadowed by paternal authority and the community's collective interest in seeing property disputes settled and families kept solvent.
For wealthier maidens, the stakes were different in scale, but not in principle. Daughters of minor lords or prosperous merchants were bartered into alliances meant to secure trade routes, ensure military aid, or simply aggrandize family standing. A girl might spend her childhood cloistered away, groomed to charm a future husband chosen by fathers and uncles, men who weighed alliances with a shrewd eye for coin and soldiers, never for affection. Those few who rebelled, eloping with poor knights or local craftsmen, risked being disowned, their dowries confiscated, sometimes even dragged back by hired men to face years in enforced seclusion until a more suitable match could be arranged. This was how the law quietly forbade dreaming, not by proclaiming "you shall not hope," but by so thoroughly chaining outward markers of status, clothing, leisure, marriage, to social rank that aspiration itself became dangerous. The village girl who imagined herself draped in damask beside a gallant knight knew, deep in her marrow, that such fantasies led only to scandal, punishment, or ruin. Even love was a commodity weighed on legal scales, its worth calculated in acres and livestock. Through these countless petty restrictions, medieval society reinforced its own survival. By dictating what people could wear, how they could eat, whom they might wed, it kept each soul neatly slotted into a grand human puzzle arranged long before their birth. Thus the fields continued to be plowed, the castles filled with feasting, and the churches rung with prayers for a harmony that depended utterly on men and women knowing their place and daring never to climb beyond it.
At the frayed edges of medieval law, where ordinary theft or quarrels over grazing rights gave way to more haunting transgressions, lay a realm of offenses so grave they threatened not merely the peace of village squares or the wealth of landlords, but the very cosmic order itself. These were crimes that dared to trespass against God, blasphemy that mocked the sacred, heresy that twisted doctrine into forbidden shapes, and witchcraft that was believed to strike a foul bargain with dark forces lurking just beyond the veil of mortal sight. For these trespasses, justice grew especially sharp, its tools honed not only by secular courts, but by tribunals that claimed their ultimate authority from heaven.
To stand accused of such crimes was to be cast adrift in a terrifying landscape where mercy wore a different face, one that seemed to smile even as it reached for the rack. Blasphemy, words spoken in anger or folly that insulted divine majesty, could doom a man's tongue to be pierced or torn out, the offending organ quite literally removed so that it might sin no more. The community gathered to watch, not out of simple bloodlust, but because such punishments reaffirmed that their world still knelt humbly before heaven. It was a visible excision of rot, a ritual scouring that promised to keep misfortune from settling over the entire village like a plague mist. More ominous still were the charges of heresy. Unlike mere acts of theft or violence, heresy was a poison of the mind, a seduction of the soul that threatened to unmake the delicate lattice of belief binding Christendom together. To whisper new doctrines, to doubt the sacraments, to read forbidden texts or follow a preacher whose fervor carried him beyond the sanctioned teachings of the Church, all of this was to dance on a blade's edge over an abyss. Ecclesiastical courts were convened in solemn halls, cloaked in incense and lit by guttering candles that seemed to cast longer shadows than daylight ever could. Here inquisitors sat, robed and remote, their questions probing not for stolen goods or bodies harmed, but for the state of a heart's secret loyalties. And when mere interrogation failed, sterner methods waited in chill stone chambers below. The medieval belief that truth ultimately belonged to God meant that extracting it, even by the application of searing irons or crushing weights, was not viewed as cruelty, but as a necessary service. Pain, so the logic ran, could purify a soul's evasions, drive out deception like smoke forced from a burning house. Thus confessions wrung from pale lips, regardless of how they were obtained, carried all the binding force needed to pronounce a ruinous sentence. Witchcraft, a term elastic enough to catch everything from herbal cunning to midnight Sabbaths whispered of by fearful neighbors, drew an especially fervent brand of justice. In earlier medieval centuries, belief in witches often took milder forms, with local superstitions handled by community gossip or minor penances. But by the late Middle Ages, an anxious church, battered by plague and schisms, grew ever more watchful for signs that the devil was stalking its flocks directly. Manuals for inquisitors described telltale marks, gave instructions for stripping and shaving suspects to reveal hidden blemishes said to be suckled by imps. Torture was applied with sanctified resolve, each scream rising through cloistered halls as a grim testament to how seriously the threat was taken. The trials themselves often spiraled into grotesque theater. Women, for it was overwhelmingly women who found themselves tangled in such accusations, were questioned about secret gatherings, about ointments that let them fly through moonlight, about betting with dark figures who promised favors in exchange for small, chilling pledges. A neighbor's sudden illness, a cow's mysterious wasting, or hail that destroyed a harvest could all serve as the flint to spark these grim inquisitions. Villages, frightened by forces they could not control, found a cruel solace in locating a scapegoat whose guilt might explain misfortune and thus promise to banish it. And so, where property crimes or petty assaults might end with fines or the stocks,
The punishments for these boundary crimes, offenses against the very line separating the sacred from the damned, descended with a heavier hand. Those convicted faced public penance in chains, their garments emblazoned with symbols of flame, or more often, the final grim procession to the stake. Here, the crowd gathered not merely to gawk, but to reassure themselves that divine order was being actively, even violently, defended. As smoke twisted into the sky, many crossed themselves and murmured prayers that such fervent purification would safeguard their homes and fields from evil's return. In these harsh judgments, we see how medieval justice functioned as far more than a system to arbitrate human squabbles. It was a desperate bulwark against chaos, moral, spiritual, even cosmic. To allow heresy, blasphemy, or witchcraft to go unpunished was to risk a collapse that stretched far beyond earthly kingdoms. By scourging these threats from their midst, communities reaffirmed their alignment with a divine hierarchy they feared to anger. Thus, the law, draped in both priestly robes and bloodied smocks, struck hardest when it sensed danger not just to bodies or barns, but to the invisible order believed to hold the universe itself in fragile, trembling balance. In dark, vaulted chambers beneath monasteries and fortress halls, where damp walls seemed to breathe with a life of their own, the medieval world constructed some of its most chilling instruments, not of war, but of confession. Here, the Inquisition perfected its craft, refining pain into a coldly precise tool for extracting truths it was certain must exist, even if a prisoner's lips had yet to betray them. These spaces were designed not merely to punish, but to compel speech, to bend both flesh and spirit until they surrendered the narratives that inquisitors believed would safeguard Christendom from corruption. At the center of these fearful rites stood the instruments themselves, each meticulously crafted to torment specific corners of the human body and mind. The strappado hoisted victims high by ropes wound about their wrists, then let them drop suddenly, stopping short in a violent jerk that tore shoulders from sockets. The rack laid them flat and stretched them inch by inch, muscles tearing in muffled pops beneath the skin. Iron boots enclosed feet that were then crushed or filled with heated wedges, while thumb screws ground delicate joints to powder. None of this was performed in secret. Clerical scribes stood by with quills poised, ready to note every utterance, every moan that might be twisted into evidence of dark pacts. But the genius, if one dares use so dreadful a word, of these proceedings lay in how they made guilt almost inevitable. Once accused, a woman entered a labyrinth with no exit. Protest her innocence too fiercely, and inquisitors suspected the devil's cunning. Weep and collapse into trembling pleas, and they saw weakness ripe for demonic manipulation. Pain was administered in carefully calibrated increments. The torment paused at strategic moments to coax murmured admissions. In this way, torture did not simply uncover witchcraft, it manufactured it, pulling elaborate confessions from quivering tongues desperate to stop the agony. Much of the evidence revolved around the so-called devil's mark, a blemish somewhere on the body thought to be insensitive to pain, proof of a pact with sinister forces. Entire teams of examiners, often male, stripped women naked and subjected them to invasive searches. Freckles, small scars, a birthmark beneath the breast or on the thigh, any of these might be solemnly noted as a sign of allegiance to darkness. Needles were brought forth to prod these spots, watching for any flinch or trickle of blood. A failure to bleed, perhaps because of poor circulation or sheer terror, sealed doom. In other cases, clever examiners pricked the same place repeatedly until numbness set in, then declared the area suspiciously dead to sensation. Records from inquisitorial archives show how predictably these rituals unfolded. A village healer might be summoned after years of quietly tending neighbors' fevers and easing childbirths with her herbs. Accusers whispered that she had too much knowledge, that sickness followed where she walked. Under questioning, she would deny any dealings with forbidden spirits, at first. Then the instruments emerged, and with them hours that stretched into eternities, each punctuated by the dull snap of tendons or the guttural sob of someone who could bear no more. Eventually, desperate for relief, she might name accomplices drawn from memory, an old rival, a young girl whose mother once refused her honey, even members of her own family. Thus, the machine of confession expanded its net, each name pulling new victims into the Inquisitor's waiting hands.
Outside the chambers, villagers gathered in uneasy clusters. The same people who had once sought the healer's aid for a lingering cough or a stubborn infant now crossed themselves fervently, grateful that suspicion pointed elsewhere, at least for the moment. In this way, the Inquisition did not merely root out alleged witches, it sowed a harvest of fear, turning tight-knit communities inward upon themselves. Trust dissolved, replaced by furtive glances and frantic efforts to appear devout enough, contrite enough, ordinary enough to avoid scrutiny. And always, woven through the grim tapestry of these proceedings, was a sanctimonious certainty. Inquisitors believed they were saving souls, both of the accused and of entire towns that might otherwise fall under the shadow of heresy or witchcraft. Torture, to their minds, was a purifier. Confession extracted by the rack or iron was still valid in the eyes of the Church, because they reasoned that only divine truth could finally emerge from agony. The broken bodies that stumbled from these chambers, bones misaligned, skin seamed with bruises and burns, carried not just pain, but the heavy burden of words forced from them, declarations that would be read aloud before judges who saw in them the final proof needed to consign someone to flame. Thus, the Inquisition became a monstrous paradox, a machine that crushed human flesh in the name of compassion, that mangled lives with the promise of salvation. In its cold logic, even silence was suspicious, a vacuum needing to be filled with cries that confirmed the worldview of those holding the winches and ropes. And so countless women, midwives, widows, outspoken wives, lonely spinsters, found themselves transformed by pain and terror into the very creatures their interrogators hunted, confessing to Sabbaths and familiars, to dark pacts sealed beneath twisted trees, simply so that the tortures might cease, even if only to be replaced by the stake. In those chambers, the line between reality and nightmare was methodically erased, leaving behind records that still murmur from cracked parchment of a time when confession was not a revelation of guilt, but the last frantic refuge from a torment that cared nothing for truth. In the winding streets and broad squares of medieval towns, justice was not content to be a silent force working behind heavy doors. It demanded an audience. Few spectacles drew the people from their homes so surely or gathered them in such dense, expectant clusters as the public execution. On these days, merchants shuttered their stalls early, apprentices slipped away from forges and looms, mothers led wide-eyed children by the hand, all drifting toward the rising hum at the center of town, where gallows creaked or scaffolds bristled with fresh sawn planks. These events were not hidden in some lonely field or hushed by secrecy. They were staged with deliberate flourish, orchestrated so that every detail might impress itself upon memory. The condemned, often marched in chains from the local jail, stumbled through jeering crowds as church bells tolled overhead, each peal marking the minutes remaining to plead for mercy or prepare to meet eternity. If it was a hanging, the wooden platform might be wreathed in evergreen boughs, a curious contrast of festive greenery against the stark promise of rope and death. Sometimes the criminal was made to mount the steps alone, sometimes prodded by guards whose polearms glinted in the sun. And when the trapdoor fell or the cart rolled away, leaving bodies to jerk and twist at the end of a short drop, there came that collective gasp, followed by murmured prayers, grim satisfaction, or even laughter. A hanging was more than punishment. It was a living sermon preached to every witness, driving home the message that law was not an abstract decree,
but a force with hands strong enough to squeeze breath from lungs. As the executed dangled, sometimes for many long moments before stilling, onlookers absorbed a lesson meant to linger each time they considered theft or betrayal. The theater of justice did not stop at the neck. Certain crimes called for harsher tableaus. A thief whose offenses exceeded the patience of the local court might find a hand or foot taken, the severed limb held aloft by an official to cries of horror or applause. Executioners, grimly practiced in such arts, often displayed the bloodied blade or axe to the crowd before wiping it down, making a ceremony of their grisly efficiency. In these moments, punishment became a ritual almost sacred, a cleansing by steel meant to cut rot from the body of the community itself. Then there were the truly grand spectacles, reserved for the gravest sins, treason, vile murders, or the dreaded stain of witchcraft. Quartering, perhaps the most ghastly performance in this dark repertoire, unfolded in stages designed to wring every drop of terror from the gathering throng. The condemned might first be hanged nearly to the point of death, revived just enough to feel the final agony as ropes pulled limbs in 4 directions, tearing muscle and sinew in a brutal declaration of the crown's unassailable power. Heads and quarters of the body were often displayed afterward on city gates or along roads, silent sentinels reminding all who passed that defiance ended in dismemberment. For witches, the climax of punishment was fire. A stake driven into the ground, bundles of dry faggots stacked high, the accused bound tightly so that the crowd might see every shudder and hear every last plea. Flames crawled upward, catching hair and cloth before racing over skin. The scent of burning flesh, sharp, fatty, unforgettable, drifted across tightly packed onlookers who crossed themselves or murmured that God's justice had been done. Some wept, some simply watched, transfixed by the awful dance of smoke and orange tongues, the dark shape writhing within. These executions served more than simple retribution. They were powerful civic rituals, reinforcing the boundaries of acceptable conduct through spectacle and fear. Officials ensured that the condemned's crimes were proclaimed in ringing voices by criers, so that no citizen might mistake what line had been crossed. Watching someone's neck snap or limbs torn asunder made abstract laws visceral, writing them into the communal imagination more forcefully than any scroll nailed to a church door. In a paradox that reveals much about human nature, such grisly events were also social gatherings. Vendors strolled the fringes, hawking pies, ale, or sweet cakes. Children chased each other between legs. Lovers stood pressed together, as though at a festival. Justice was entertainment, an occasion to see friends, gossip, and feel the collective shiver that came when death, so near and so plain, reminded them all how thin the wall stood between the living and the grave. And when it was over, the last kick, the final guttering sigh, the executioner's brief bow to mark his work complete, people drifted back to their lives, changed in ways they often could not articulate. Fields were tilled, merchants returned to scales and ledgers, housewives stirred pots over low flames. Yet beneath it all pulsed the vivid memory of rope, blade, and pyre. The law had spoken, not merely in fines or decrees scratched on parchment, but in blood and smoke, and the dark hush that always fell in the moment just after. It was a theater with no script needed beyond the unspoken promise that order, for now, had been restored, and that anyone might yet find themselves center stage should their steps stray too far from paths approved by church and crown alike. To peer into the minds of medieval people, to truly understand why so many accepted, even supported, such harsh punishments and elaborate spectacles of pain, is to enter a world lit by very different torches than our own. In those flickering lights, Justice was not simply about balancing harm done with penalties paid. It was about preserving a delicate cosmic harmony, warding off terrors that loomed larger than any individual wrongdoing. It was a theater of survival as much as morality, played out on blood-stained platforms under the approving or apprehensive gaze of neighbors and kin. Fear was the deepest root. The medieval person lived in constant proximity to forces that felt immense and unpredictable. Storms could flatten crops overnight. Disease might creep invisibly from house to house. Wolves roamed forests at dusk, and armies could appear on the horizon with little warning. Beneath all this lay a spiritual dread, a terror not only of God's anger, but of a world teeming with demons and malicious spirits eager to slip through the cracks of human sin. To maintain the fragile protections offered by divine favor, society had to be vigilant, swift, and sometimes brutal. Every public execution, every hand lopped from a thief's arm, or witch's pyre kindled in the square, was an assurance that the community still aligned itself with heaven's order, that they remained, however shakily, on the right side of an eternal ledger. This is why punishments were so often staged before crowds. To see justice enacted was to participate in a ritual cleansing. The people gathered not merely to satisfy a grim curiosity, but to bear witness, to nod and murmur assent as law and divine will joined hands. The very publicness of it all, the shouting criers, the tolling bells, the priest's solemn prayers before a hanging, turned punishment into a kind of communal exorcism. Together, villagers absorbed the lesson that wrongdoing invited catastrophe, not just upon the individual, but upon all. By seeing it cut away, they hoped to prevent ruin from falling like rot upon their fields and families. Interwoven with fear was a profound trust in divine judgment. Medieval theology did not envision a distant, indifferent God. The Almighty watched closely, moved events, weighed hearts. If a criminal confessed under torture, many believed it must be because God permitted or compelled the truth to surface. If an ordeal by fire or water ended in injury, it was not viewed as cruelty inflicted by human hands, but as the Creator's unmistakable verdict. Even when the innocent surely suffered, the explanation usually circled back to hidden sins, to guilt known only to God. It was a worldview that demanded humility before fate and resignation that earthly trials reflected a higher, perfect justice, however painful they appeared. Moreover, for most people, the law was not some abstract, impersonal force. It was woven into daily life through customs, oaths, and local lords whose power was visible, tangible. Punishments reinforced social bonds by clearly marking who stood outside the circle of trust. The executioner's axe did not simply strike a criminal, it reaffirmed the safety of everyone else by showing that the dangerous thread had been cut. Each severed hand, each charred stake, was a pledge that the community would survive, that the walls would hold against chaos for a little longer. And there was also comfort in certainty. Medieval people inherited a universe laid out in clear hierarchies. Peasants below knights, knights beneath kings, all under God. Justice reflected and maintained that same hierarchy. It assured each person of their place, and by punishing those who transgressed, whether by stealing a neighbor's grain, denying church teachings, or consorting with forbidden forces, it protected a structure that felt as essential to life as the rising sun. The sight of law in action was a reminder that there was an order to things, that wrongs would be corrected, that heaven watched and approved. So it seemed fair, even merciful by the standards of the time. Better that one woman be burned for witchcraft than risk her poison spreading to others. Better that a thief lose a hand than invite divine displeasure upon an entire village. Public punishments were a language everyone understood, regardless of whether they could read Latin law codes or interpret theological disputations. They were a living grammar of sin and consequence, performed again and again until each heart was inscribed with the knowledge that wrongdoing would not pass unnoticed.
Thus, undergirded by fear of supernatural wrath, trust in providential justice, and the raw necessity of community survival, the brutal spectacles of medieval law felt not merely justified, but indispensable. They were as much about collective reassurance as they were about deterring crime. By watching the guilty suffer, medieval people found reassurance that their fragile world was still ordered by divine principle, that the sun would rise, the crops would grow, and unseen terrors might be kept at bay so long as each sin was answered in kind. In this hard economy of fear and faith, punishment was not merely retribution. It was a solemn promise that the universe still held together, that God's shadow passed over them approvingly, and that their little patch of earth remained, for now, spared from chaos. When we look back across the centuries at the shadowed courtyards where peasants gathered to watch hands severed or bodies swaying at the end of coarse ropes, it is tempting to sigh with relief, to believe we have long since shaken off the grip of such brutal customs. We live now in cleaner streets, under calmer skies, with courts that rely on careful evidence and rights read aloud, instead of confessions wrung from torn muscles and terror. Surely we have left behind the crude theaters of fear and pain that once propped up medieval notions of justice. And yet, beneath the surface of our laws and our polite assurances of equality, faint echoes of those distant days still murmur. The same human instincts that once pressed villagers shoulder to shoulder around scaffolds have not vanished. They have only found subtler stages. We still crave public reckonings. When someone is exposed for deceit or violence, our eyes turned eagerly toward the spectacle, though today it may play out across glowing screens rather than blood-soaked platforms. The urge to watch, to see shame meted out before a crowd, remains stitched into us by countless generations who believed that only visible punishment could heal an invisible wound in the moral fabric. Our modern reverence for due process, for impartial juries and measured penalties, is in part a deliberate reaction against the arbitrary terrors of the past. But even this carries a hidden legacy. The medieval conviction that wrongdoing tears at the very heart of community life still shapes how we respond to crimes. We talk of trust broken, of harm not just to victims, but to the shared peace of neighborhoods and nations. We expect more than mere restitution. We want a reaffirmation that order stands firm, that boundaries have been defended. The medieval crowd gasped as thieves were flogged. We breathe out similar tension when a gavel falls, when a sentence is handed down. Justice, even shorn of whips and flames, still soothes our oldest anxieties. The obsession with hierarchy, too, has only partially retreated. We no longer enforce sumptuary laws that dictate who may wear silk or gold, yet we mark status by brands, by gated streets, by invitations extended or withheld. We no longer believe that God ordains a night to feast while peasants starve, but inequality persists, rationalized now by market forces or personal merit, yet no less powerful in drawing lines between those who have and those who serve. The medieval idea that one's station was a sign of divine favor or failure may have faded, but the instinct to sort people into layers, to reassure ourselves that such divisions are somehow natural, lingers quietly. Even our ideals of honor and loyalty still trace faint patterns first laid down in those distant centuries. The knight's vow to defend his liege, the villager's duty to stand by kin, the priest's solemn promise to uphold the faith. These old codes ripple through our modern reverence for contracts, for oaths of office, for the weight we place on a promise given before witnesses. We talk of honor among thieves, of reputations that can be stained or redeemed, using language rooted in a medieval world where shame was as real a punishment as any blade.
The medieval passion for public affirmation of one's place and virtue survives in our fascination with reputation, our dread of scandal, our collective hunger to see integrity tested and proven. Perhaps most poignantly, the deep medieval fear of chaos, of a universe that might slip without warning into famine, plague, or spiritual ruin, still beats in us too. We reassure ourselves with laws, institutions, elaborate systems of accountability, all designed to hold the world steady. When crises come, pandemics, economic collapses, sudden acts of violence, we flinch not only from the direct harm, but from the older, darker terror that perhaps the order we rely on is more fragile than we dare admit. In those moments, the medieval peasant whispering prayers before the scaffold does not seem so distant after all.
So, what remains of those old laws, those harsh rituals of justice? Not their cruelties, we hope, but the complicated human yearnings that built them, the desire for safety, for fairness as clear and undeniable as a head upon a block, for wrongs to be set right so life might continue without the gnaw of dread. We have tried, over long centuries, to temper these instincts with compassion, to craft systems that weigh evidence over rumor, that prize dignity over spectacle. But in quiet hours, if we listen closely, we can still hear the echo of drums summoning villagers to the square, still feel the old trembling relief when punishment promised the world was once more set back on its proper rails. And perhaps it is this gentle acknowledgement that our modern notions of justice, equality, and honor were shaped in part by ages of darkness and fear that helps us move forward with humility. We inherit not only the errors of our forebears, but their desperate hopes, that somewhere above or within us resides a principle stronger than hunger, sharper than any axe, capable of restoring balance when the fragile lines we walk inevitably falter. In that quiet admission lies a kinship stretching back through the centuries, reminding us that every attempt to build a fairer world stands upon ground long haunted by shadows, and that the work of holding the darkness at bay is never truly done.